Well, it is good to be with you. What a great church you have. I just love coming to different countries and places and getting to see what God's doing. And boy, how exciting it is to be part of your church and to talk to your pastor about all that God is doing through you and your new building that's coming and just to worship with you. How exciting to be a part of what God's doing here. I want to share with you just a little bit of something that God's been teaching me, a very, very simple lesson, very simple truth, but one that will change your life. As the pastor said, I spent many years in Canada. I grew up there for the most part. I'm an American and a Canadian, but I've spent the majority of my life in Canada, and I was leading a seminary there for a number of years, for 13 years, and while I was leading that school, the trustees, the people that were in charge of the school, they decided after I'd been there a long time that they wanted to give me and my wife a special gift to thank me for all the time and the work. And so they gave me a gift that was just amazing. It was a wonderful gift. They gathered some air miles and donations and various things, and they announced that they were going to send me and my wife to Hawaii. Now, you have to understand that in Canada, there is no greater gift you can give a Canadian than to send them to Hawaii in the wintertime when it could be 20, 30 below zero. And so we were excited because I'd never been there before at that time. But then I had 3 teenage children. And all my children came to me and they said, Dad, we're very concerned about you. I said, what are you concerned about me for? I'm going to Hawaii. And they said, well, that's the point. They said, we can't imagine that you will enjoy even one moment of your time over there, all the while knowing that your only children are freezing in the cold back in Canada. And so my free romantic getaway with my wife turned into a very expensive family vacation when I now had to pay for my 3 freeloading children to come with me to Hawaii. So I got a townhouse right on the beach. I thought, well, we might as well enjoy this. We've never been here before. And so we pull up in front of where we're going to stay in the townhouse there. And my 3 children jump out of the vehicle. They rush inside. They get their swimming clothes on, and they run to the beach. Not one child said anything to me like, Dad, can I help you with all of that luggage? They were just gone. And so my wife is sorting out the townhouse, and I realize we have no groceries. I better go get some food. So while my kids are lying on the beach, I drive around the island trying to find a grocery store to get groceries. And I finally come back. I say to my wife, come on, let's go to the beach. We haven't even seen it yet. So we make our way down to the water, and my son Daniel is about 15 at the time. He sees me coming, and he says, Dad, I am starving to death. He said, what are the chances of you going back and making me a sandwich and getting me a cold drink? I said, there is no chance of that happening. You go get your own, I said. But I said, there's a sliding door, a patio door. I said, I left it unlocked so that you can go back and go in. And I said, there's all kinds of groceries in the kitchen. Just take whatever you want, but clean up your mess. I said, I know this son. He's very messy. And I said, don't go in there and make a mess of everything, because I'm not going to spend my only week in Hawaii cleaning up after you. So he goes back, goes through the patio door, finds all kinds of food in the kitchen. He's excited. He sees his favorite chocolate cookies. And he's so excited, he rips the bag open, and he's cramming these cookies in his mouth. And he's spewing chocolate particles and crumbs all over the kitchen. And then he sees his favorite crisps, and he rips that bag open, and he's shoving those in his mouth, and crumbs are falling on the floor, and he gets a drink, and he's making a sandwich, and he's destroying the kitchen. And then he gets a bunch of food, and he thinks, I'll go sit in the living room and sit down and just eat this food before I go back to the beach. And now his swimming clothes are soaking wet, and he should put a towel on the furniture first, but he doesn't. He sits down, and now there's sand and there's wetness spreading all over the furniture. He puts his feet up, on the coffee table. Now there's sand spreading there. There's a trail of debris all the way back in the kitchen where he's been eating all the way. He's just destroying the place. And then he sees the television on the wall. He thinks I might as well watch television while I'm eating. He turns on the TV and he sees his hockey game on. And my son grew up in Canada, and that's his very favorite thing to watch. He can't believe there's a hockey game in Hawaii. And so he later said to me, Dad, in that moment, I thought to myself, life doesn't get better than this. He said, I look out to my right, I see the waves of Hawaii rolling into shore. He said, I look in my lap, I see the food of the gods right at my fingertips. He said, I look ahead, I see my favorite program on television. He said, I look to my left, and I see a strange man wearing nothing but a towel. And he said, in that moment, I realized I was in the wrong townhouse. He had walked through an unlocked patio door. He'd been in such a hurry to run to the beach, he had not looked back to see which one was his. This man, on his way from the airport, had stopped and gotten food, and now he was having a shower to get freshened up when he heard the television come on in his room. And fortunately wrapped a towel around himself and came out and found my son eating all of his groceries. We spent the rest of the week trying to avoid our next door neighbor. I said to my son, did you not look around? Could you not tell that was not our apartment? I could tell you many stories about that particular son. But you know what I found is funny, and as much as we like to laugh about that, I work with people all the time who are not aware of what's happening around their life. God is working around their life. God is doing things, and they don't see it. They don't have their eyes open. They're sort of walking through life, going to work, going to school, paying their bills, and they never see all the things that are happening all around their life. I want to share with you just one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament for a moment, and then just tell you a couple of stories about people that have discovered in the midst of their ordinary life that God was there. And God had been there all along. They just hadn't seen. They're like my son, that one day they open their eyes and they realize, wait a minute, I'm not where I thought I was. And I need to hurry and get there as quickly as possible. Genesis chapter 28. Let me just read a couple verses. I'll start in verse 10. This is the story of Jacob. It says, Now Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. So he came to a certain place and stayed there all night because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to the heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And in you all your seed, and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Jacob had lived a life that was a disaster. When he was born, he was already trying to grab hold of his brother, his twin brother Esau. Even as he's being born, he's reaching out, trying to hold on to his brother and say, no, you're not going to get out first. I'm going to be the oldest. He was always living a life looking out for himself. He was always thinking, what's the best for me? He didn't care if he cheated his brother. He didn't care if he lied to his father. He didn't care if he
conspired with his mother. He didn't care who he cheated, who he robbed. All he cared about was him. And finally, that kind of attitude caught up with him. And he cheated his brother so severely, lied to his father so shamefully, that now his brother wanted to kill him. And Jacob had to run for his life. Jacob had been living in the promised land. God had promised his father Isaac, I'm going to give you all this land one day. All of your descendants will live here. But now Jacob's leaving the promised land. There was one day where he thought, one day I'll live in this wonderful place. This will be mine. Now he's leaving it. He's saying, I've made such a mistake with my life. I've made such a disaster of my life that I'll never be able to accept and enjoy the promises of God. So he was leaving. And that night, all alone in the darkness, he doesn't even have a pillow. He's got to lay his head on a rock. That's how bad his life's getting. In the middle of the night, God opens his eyes. And in a dream, God shows him that right where he is, God is working. There's a ladder going up to heaven, and God is sending angels down to the earth, and they're coming back and reporting to him. And the picture that Jacob gets is that right where he is, God is working. God is working out all of his purposes, and God says, I've never left you. You may not have seen me, but I've always been with you. And I've never given up on you. And even now, the angels of heaven are working out their purposes in your life. And one day, even though you think that your life is a complete failure, all the families of the earth will be blessed because of what I do in your life. Let me ask you, does God have the capacity to take an ordinary life like yours and bless the peoples of the earth? One person that God is pleased to bless, and he can bless all the peoples of the earth. Do you know where God is working around your life right now? Do you know what God's doing in your life? Most of us, sometimes we see a little bit of what God's doing, but it's hard to see everything because God's always working. In fact, Ephesians 3:20 is my favorite verse for my life, and it says God is able to do exceedingly abundantly more than you could ever even imagine. You could even pray or think. That's what God wants to do in your life. If you're not experiencing that in your life, you've settled for less than what God wants to do. I want to just, let me tell you another story about my son Daniel, because it's probably one of the most profound stories that happened in my life. My son Daniel one time said, Dad, why is it whenever you want to tell a story about a child who was obedient and did a good thing, you tell a story about my brother or my sister, but when you want to tell a story about someone who did something crazy, you tell about me? I said, son, I don't make the news. I just report it. I said, if you want me to tell good stories about you, I said, give me better material to work with. But when he was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, all of a sudden he began to suffer with insomnia. He couldn't sleep at night. Sometimes he'd go 72 hours and not be able to sleep. And then he'd have to go to school all day. And he was so tired he couldn't even stay awake in school. But when he'd go home at night, he'd wake right up. And so we took him to doctors and hospitals and all kinds of clinics that were experts in sleep, and nothing we could do could help him go to sleep. And he was getting so discouraged, we had to pull him out of school. His health was getting very bad. He was always tired. He was getting depressed. And as his father, I was praying and saying, God, help my son. Help him to go to sleep. But no matter what we did, he still would stay awake. And I was worried. I thought, my son I've told him all of his life that he can trust God. Now he's praying and asking God to help him just go to sleep at night, and nothing is changing. It's just only getting worse. One night, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and my son, the doctors told my son, if you can't sleep, don't just lie in bed getting frustrated. Do something relaxing. So my son plays the guitar, and so he went down into the basement, got his guitar, and he's playing, but he's not getting sleepy. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's still wide awake. And he realizes he's not going to go to sleep that night. And something in his heart just broke. He just couldn't take it anymore. I don't even know this. I'm sleeping upstairs in my room. I don't even know that down in the basement my teenage son is giving up. So he cried out to God. He said, God, are you out there? Do you even know that I exist? Do you know what I'm suffering? God, I keep praying, but I'm not even sure that you hear me, that you're listening to me, or that you love me. He said, God, if you can hear me, just let me know that you know what I'm going through, that you care. I'm just a teenage boy in a little town in Canada. Maybe you just have more important things to do than to worry about whether a teenager can sleep or not in Canada. But if you're there, I need to know. Well, my son didn't sleep that night. About 2 days later, my wife sent my son to the post office to get our mail. And my son found there was an envelope in there for him. And you know that teenagers today don't get paper mail. It's all electronic. And he looked at this envelope and said to his mother, what do I click on to get this to open? He said, I don't know what to do with this. And so he opened it up, and it was from a girl that was in our youth group. And this girl told her story. She played on the volleyball team in high school. And she'd gone to a tournament that night, and she got home very, very late. She was so tired that she later confessed that she was so tired she didn't even brush her teeth. She just fell into bed, exhausted, fell right to sleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up, and she just had this terrible burden for my son. And she started to call him on the phone to see if he was okay, but she looked at the clock and thought, oh, it's way too late to be calling him. I'll just check with him tomorrow. And she went to get back into bed, and she felt like God said, no, you've got to do something tonight. So she sat at her desk, and she got out a piece of paper, and she just wrote a note. And she told Daniel some of what was happening, and she said, Daniel, this may not make any sense to you, but God told me to tell you that he knows what you're going through, and he loves you. She wrote the verse from Matthew 11 that says, come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. She said, this may not make any sense to you at all, she said, but before I could go to sleep, I had to tell you, God, hold on to God. He's there with you. Well, when Daniel read that note, it answered every question that he had prayed to God 2 days earlier. And so he ran all the way to this girl's house and found her and said, when did you write this note? She said, well, it was the night that he prayed to God. He said, did you see what time it was when you wrote this note? She said, it was 3 o'clock in the morning. That's why I knew it would be too late to call you. And in that moment, my son realized that even as he was crying out to God in his basement of his house, that several blocks away, God was waking up someone else saying, hurry, get your pen and paper, start writing. There's someone who needs to know that I know what he's going through, and I love him, and he needs to have hope. Well, that encouraged my son, but my son's sleep didn't get any better. And so a couple of months later, it was the summer in Canada, and all the teenagers were going to a camp, to a conference for one week in the summer. And our church was sending 45 teenagers to that camp. But there were other churches. There were several hundred altogether going. But our youth minister was very concerned about our teenagers because for the first time ever, there were teenagers who were doing drugs and were into some trouble that he'd never seen before in our church. And he's very concerned. So that one night on Tuesday night, he got all of our teenagers together at the end of the night, and he said, I want you to tell me what's happening with you. I'm concerned about you. What's going on with you? And at first, no one would speak. Finally, Daniel spoke up. He said, well, I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but he said, you all know that I can't sleep. And he said, a couple of months ago, I prayed and said, God, just let me know if you care. And he said, God told me he loves me. God told me that he knows what I'm going through. But he said, I just can't understand why a God who would love me would let me suffer like that. I don't understand how a loving God wouldn't just help me to go to sleep at night. And a 14-year-old girl was there, and she raised her hand and said, can I say something? She said, you all know about my life. She said, about a year or so ago, my parents got a divorce. My father left. I hardly ever see my father anymore. My mother got remarried, and a man moved into our house, and he had 2 sons, and I was moved out of my bedroom. They put my stepbrothers in my bedroom. They put me down in the basement. It was as if there was no place for me anymore. My father never saw me. My mother was too busy for me. There was nobody who cared about me. And she said, I got a boyfriend, someone that would care about me. And then one day I discovered that he was cheating on me with my best friend. She said, I was so discouraged, I just gave up. She said, I went to a party one night, and I did some things that were very embarrassing, very humiliating. And when I got home late that night and I sat down at my computer in my bedroom, I thought to myself, when I go to school the next day, everyone in my school is going to be laughing at me. It'll be the most embarrassing, humiliating day of my life. And she said, all of a sudden, I thought to myself, I would rather die than have to go to school tomorrow and face the shame of what I've done tonight. She said, the moment I said that, I suddenly had these awful, evil thoughts come through my mind. I could visualize exactly how I could take my life, and I would never have to face tomorrow. She said it was so compelling. It was as if something was taking over my body and my thoughts. And I was afraid I really was going to take my life, she said. I was so afraid I actually tried to cry out to my mother to wake her up and get her to help me. And she said, but I couldn't even get a sound to come out of my mouth. And I was just shaking with fear, not knowing what was happening to me. She said, I looked at my computer, and there was, in the social network she used at the time, she could only see one of her contacts that was still logged in. And it was my son, Daniel. They weren't even friends, but they went to the same youth group. They never normally ever messaged, but because he was in the youth group, he was one of her contacts, and he was logged in. She sent him a message, Daniel, are you still awake? And in a moment, a message came back, of course I'm awake. I never sleep. Why are you awake? She began to tell my son of the terrifying, lonely, dark night that she was going through. And in a moment, my son began to tell her, I'm familiar with those dark, lonely nights. And he said, I've just learned to hold on to God even when nothing else makes sense. And he said, I'll hold on to God with you. And they began to message back and forth. Ultimately, they left their house and met in a neighborhood between their houses and under a street lamp. And they began to walk around the block. And this girl said, when we went around the seventh time, we got around the seventh time, and she said, I saw the sun starting to come up. She said, I knew I was going to live. And she said to the youth group that night in the summer, she said, if Daniel had not been awake that night, I think I would be dead today. And then a 17-year-old boy raised his hand, and he said, I need to tell you my story. This boy had been adopted, and he didn't believe his biological parents had ever wanted him. Now he didn't believe his adopted parents wanted him either. And so he became friends with the local drug dealer of his high school. And one day he just thought to himself, no one has ever wanted me. No one on the earth wants me. And he said, the only thing my life does is just spread drug addiction, bondage, and pain. He said this world would be a better place if I wasn't in it. So he decided that he would take his life. And he set a date, a time. He thought at 4 o'clock in the morning, my parents will be sleeping. Nobody will know. And he planned to cut his wrists and bleed to death in his own bedroom. And so at the appointed hour, he got out a package of ice that he had in his freezer. And he put the ice next to his wrist, and he held it there. And he thought, I'll just freeze my wrist for a moment so it doesn't hurt so much when I cut my veins. And as he sat there on his bed with ice on his arm, he suddenly thought, it's just so sad. In just a moment, I'm going to be dead. And I just feel like I should talk to one more person before I die. But who am I going to talk to at 4 o'clock in the morning? But by this time, my son was kind of famous for being the insomniac of the community. And this boy never talked to my son, but he knew about my son. He knew my son never slept. And so he thought, well, I'll call Daniel Blackaby. Maybe he's awake at 4 in the morning. But then he thought, well, what if I wake up Mr. Blackaby at 4 in the morning? He'll be mad at me. So he thought, well, I'll just let the phone ring 2 times. And if after 2 times Daniel doesn't answer, then it means he must be asleep, and I just won't wake up the family. So he dialed our house, and after 1 ring, Daniel answered the phone. Daniel was sitting right by the phone at 4 in the morning. And he said, He said, "Why are you calling our house at 4 in the morning? What's going on with you? This is very strange. Tell me what you're doing." And finally, Daniel got this boy to agree to meet him for breakfast and to talk with him first before he did anything else. And that summer, that boy sat in front of all those teenagers and said, "If Daniel had not been awake that night, I'd be dead today." And then 4 other kids all shared how in various ways they were struggling and going through difficult times. And every time they were ready to give up, they looked and saw Daniel still coming to church, still holding on to God. He played guitar in the worship band. And they said, we kept thinking, if Daniel, after all that he's been through, is still holding on to God, maybe I can hold on to God a bit longer as well. At the end of that week, I drove to the church to pick up my kids from camp. I saw Daniel come off the bus, and the look on his face just told me that he had met with God that week. And I said, "Daniel, what happened?" He said, "Dad, you won't believe this." He said, "All this time I thought God just didn't even know I existed, that God must not care about me." He said, "I thought maybe God was angry at me and just giving me a really hard life." But he said, "This week, God showed me He's been working in my life the whole time." He said that there's evil forces coming to destroy people. And he said, God didn't ask the pastor to stay awake all night, to take late night phone calls. He said the youth minister didn't have the graveyard shift. He said, God, use me, he said. He said, Dad, there's people alive today because of what I went through. You see, God had shown my son that there was a ladder going from heaven right there to his life. And God was working and saving people and accomplishing His purposes. And at the worst time in my son's life, the hardest experience of his life, he realized God's here too. In fact, now that same son, that was a couple of years ago, now he's married. He's actually finishing a PhD in apologetics. He's actually published 5 books now, writing to young people, encouraging them to have hope. And I was talking to that son the other day. I said, Daniel, can you believe all the things that God has done in your life? And he said, Dad, and you know the most amazing thing? He said, every good thing God's doing in my life today, I can trace it back to when I couldn't sleep. The worst time in my life, I can't believe how many good things God has done. I don't know what you're going through, but I can tell you something. God is with you, and God's working. Whether you can see Him or not, just like Jacob. You might think I'm in the hardest place in my life. No one even knows where I am. No one even cares. My prayer for you is that God would open your eyes in the same way. And all of a sudden you could see God knows exactly where you are. God's never forsaken. You may have forsaken Him. You may have turned your back on Him. He's still pursuing you. He's still working and wanting to use your life to make a difference. I could tell you many stories. Let me just tell you one other story. One of the most impactful ones for me was I met a man named Burl Kane. He had a degree in agriculture, and he thought he would work helping farmers and people grow crops. But by really a divine circumstance, he got a job running a prison in America. In fact, the prison he went to was considered at that time the most violent prison in all of America. There's 5,200 inmates there, men. 3,700 of those inmates were serving a life sentence, which in that state in America means your life. You could live to be 120 years old. You'd spend every remaining day in that prison. There's elderly men. There's people on life support still in prison because they'll never leave. Of the other 1,500 inmates, the average sentence is 91 years. So you can imagine some of those inmates saying, I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm only here for 91 years, and then I get to leave. So you can imagine it's a hopeless place. I met a person that was serving 19 life sentences. Can you imagine that? By the way, you can only serve one life sentence. The other 18 were all extra. So if you're never leaving jail, it doesn't really matter to some of those men if you kill someone else, because they can't punish you any worse. So there were prisoners there who would actually, every night before you went to sleep, you'd have a partner, and you would say, if you watch me for the first half of the night, You wake me up and I'll watch you for the second half of the night, because you were afraid if you both went to sleep, someone would kill you in your sleep. It was a dangerous, dangerous, evil place. And so here's where Burl, he's told, you run this prison. One of the previous wardens was kidnapped by some of the inmates, and they forced him at gunpoint out of the prison where they were going to take his life. It was a dangerous place. And here this Christian man is told, do a good job there. Don't get fired, or don't get kidnapped, and try to keep control of all these evil, dangerous men. But he was going through, well, interestingly, in that prison, they perform capital punishment. So they execute men there. And they have one area that's called death row. And I've been there on 2 occasions. And if you want to talk about a sobering place, there was 88 men, all in separate cells, waiting to be taken to the death chamber and put to death for their crimes. It was a bleak and dark place. Well, one day, Burl is told, you've got to commit an execution. You've got to put a man to death. The courts have said he must die. And so that's his job. He's got to do that. And so there in the execution chamber, just after midnight, I've been in that chamber. I've seen it. There's a bed, and it's got handcuffs on it and Velcro, and you strap in the inmate, and they have a lethal injection that's put into an intravenous. And right after midnight, he's in the room with this man, and he stands back where the man can't see him, and there's the guards waiting for the signal. And Burl just puts his thumb down like this. And in a moment, the lethal injection has come in, and the man is dead. So Burl's filling out the forms. He's trying to do a good job, sign all the papers, filed all the paperwork. And as he's on his way home, he senses God speaking to him. And God says, you just sent a man into eternity. Did you ever tell him about me? Burl thinks to himself, God, no, I'm just trying to do my job. It's a terrible job. These are terrible people. I just don't want to get fired. And God said to him, I didn't put you on this planet just to do your job. I put you on this planet to change the world. I put you on this planet to do my work, not just properly file all of your paperwork at the end of the day. You need to see where I'm working. And God, and Burl Cain at that time was going through the study, Experiencing God, that my father wrote. The very first truth of Experiencing God says God is always working around you. Just open your eyes and see. And Burl said, well, I don't think God even knows the address of this prison. This is such an ungodly place. It's such an evil place. Everywhere I look, all I see is what Satan has done. I don't see anything that God is doing. But he felt convicted to think, well, maybe God could even be in a place as evil and dark and hopeless as this. And so he took that Experiencing God study. He went to death row, and he asked if any of the men wanted to study that material. And a bunch of people said they did. And so they began to study Experiencing God as these men were waiting to be executed. Many of them became Christians. And so then they offered it to the whole prison population, and hundreds of those inmates became Christians. And I've seen the charts and the graphs, and the violence in that prison, the most violent prison in America, dropped by 73%. People couldn't believe it, that a place where people were being murdered every week, and all of a sudden, people were not, now they were not even using profanity in that prison. And they used to murder people every week. Many of those people who became Christians, then they felt God calling them to become pastors. And so they eventually started a Bible college in that prison to train all the inmates who want to train to be pastors. I've actually taught classes when I've been there. The only seminary class, there's like 60 men all there with their Bibles and their notebooks and their textbooks. And I'm thinking to myself, in this room of 60 people, I'm the only person in the room who's not killed someone. That's just like bizarre for me to even think about. I'm looking around thinking what these men have done. Now they're studying to be pastors. And when you graduate, they let you be a pastor. They have all these little churches all over. When I've been there, I was there last summer, and I talked to these inmates, and they'll say, oh, I'm the pastor of this church over here. There's 60 men that are in my church, and I care for them, and we worship God together. And all over that prison now, there's little churches all over the place. And so many people heard about what was happening in that prison that they contacted Burl and they said, hey, how can I get some of your inmates to come to my prison that I'm in charge of? And so they started sending out missionaries. If you can imagine, a guy sending, here's people's, one guy has a 1,500-year life sentence. And now he's going out and doing mission work. And they would transfer 2 inmates at a time to other prisons. And those prisoners would get to the new prison, and they'd start teaching Bible studies and experiencing God. One prison, after 6 months of having 2 missionaries, the violence in their prison had dropped by 48%. And I talked to Burl, and I said, Burl, how do you explain that? In fact, it was just amazing to me. It's so many, in fact, in that prison, I went into the chapel. I was going to preach, building kind of about like this, a little bit bigger. And there's a bell outside. It's their church bell they have in front of their prison chapel. They said, do you know the story about our bell? I said, no, what, tell me about it. They said, well, there was a church that was being built, and that was the bell they were going to use on their bell tower. But when they were raising it up with a pulley to put it in place, the rope slipped. The bell came falling down. It hit a worker in the head, and it killed him. And the church thought, we can't use that bell in our church. It took a life. It's a murderer bell. And so they put it up for sale online if someone wanted to buy a bell that had killed somebody. And the prison bought the bell. And they put it up, and they said, we're going to redeem that bell. And now every time it rings, it's going to call all kinds of murderers to come and worship God and celebrate that God has changed their life, just like he changed the bell. As I talked to Burl, I looked around. It's just amazing. I've been there last summer. I took my son Daniel actually with me, and I walked down death row. And you go cell by cell, these people who are there all day long. And they're telling me their story about how God found them, how they were such evil, dark people, but God found them there in prison and saved them and transformed them. And now they're praying for their kids on the outside that they'll find Christ and not end up in prison like they did. And I'm looking at that and saying, God, if you could be at work in this place, then who knows where else you're working. I could tell you, wherever you work, wherever you go to school, wherever you live, God is there. The question is, have you opened your eyes to see what he's doing? And he's working right here. Sometimes you could even go to church and not see what God's doing right next to you. Sometimes you come to church, you're so busy about what the music is, you forget that God's there. You wonder about the sermon, but you don't hear from God. It's the saddest thing to come right into the church of God and not see the activity of God. But he's here. And he will be waiting for you when you get to work tomorrow, when you go to school. My challenge to you as you go is keep your spiritual eyes open. Just like Jacob. Doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how ordinary you are. God is there. And you don't want to spend your life just paying your bills. You don't want to just spend your whole life trying to just do your job. You want to spend your life going with God, doing God's stuff, and looking back over your life and saying, I can't believe God used an ordinary life like mine to do so much. Well, let me pray with you, and I'll be done. Lord, thank you for these who've come here tonight, and thank you for being a God who can take a Jacob who has made so many mistakes and yet make him such a blessing. And God, thank you that you can do that with us as well. And I pray that just like with Jacob, Lord, some of us get so busy and consumed with work and bills and responsibilities and pressures and commitments that we don't see you. And you're right there, working away. God, forgive us for being so focused on ourselves that we don't see you. That we get so focused on what other people are doing that we don't see what you're doing. And so, God, even as we go from this place, but maybe before we even go to bed tonight, God, would you show us where you're at work? It might be in our own home. It might be with a family member. It might be with our neighbor, roommate. God, tomorrow when we go about our day, don't help us not to miss what you're doing. God, we want to spend our life going with you, doing what you do. Use these ordinary lives to do extraordinary things. Thank you for being that kind of God. And may we never settle for anything less than your very best for our life. We may have been leaving the promised land like Jacob. We may have assumed that we're too ordinary. We've made too many mistakes to be of use. God, forgive us for ever thinking you couldn't take our life and do a miracle with us as well. And so, God, some of us are in the wrong place. If we're like my son Daniel, we're just not really aware of what's going on. God, open our eyes. Help us to see you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.